Hey guys, welcome back to the workshop, and today we're going to be discussing the topic of tempering. So, as we covered last episode, we hardened a couple of blades. This is one of them. Now the reason I'm holding this with tongs is because this has already been tempered with the oven, and that is the first subject we're going to cover, oven tempering. Now, there are a lot of arguments about what the proper temperature is for, tempering blades. And the truth is that there's no right or wrong answer. The big one is, what hardness do you want? What flexibility do you want? And what steel are you working with? So each steel is going to temper differently at different temperatures. Each steel is going to have different properties at different temperature cycles, that kind of stuff. The most important thing to remember about tempering is that it's a matter of time and temperature, much like with quenching, where you have soak times for certain steels and you don't for others. Tempering is one of those things that you want to do over a significant amount of time, and that's so that you can get a full soak through of that tempering so that the entire piece of steel is tempered rather than just the surface of the steel. The advantage of the oven temper, as I covered in my full deep dive on heat treating in general, was that you don't have to grind the surface, you don't have to look for colors. You're controlling the temperature purely with the oven. Now this is still pretty warm, but basically this came straight out of the quench, went into the oven and started tempering. I tempered this at 180 degrees Celsius for 2 cycles of 2 hours. So that is all that was needed to temper this completely. It's ready to be a knife. That's it. I am going to take this through one further heat treating performance or tempering performance, but that should be all that it needs at this stage. The other two we've got, I have another blade here that I made in a live stream a while ago, which has now been hardened this morning off camera. And the other blade that we edge quenched, or actually partially quenched, given that it was heated only at the edge and then fully quenched in water and then oil. So it was different, it was interrupted water quench. So we're going to temper these two using 2 different methods, and the third one using a third different method. But the first method is oven tempering, which is pretty self-explanatory. You stick it in the oven, you turn the oven on. But the next tempering we're going to do is this little blade, and we're going to need to use a charcoal forge. But as I said before, anything that doesn't require oven tempering is going to need to be able to see the surface of the steel. And this grey colouring is not good enough. We're going to have to get this back to bright steel. So I'm going to use a worn out belt on my grinder just to remove that top surface. Now I have to be very careful not to bend the blade or put too much pressure on it, or it could snap it because it's still in its fully hardened state. If you don't have a belt grinder, you could use a wheel from a bench grinder. You could use a grinding disc from an angle grinder, either with the angle grinder just grinding it or just scrub the surface. A sharpening stone, a piece of brick, a piece of limestone, anything that's hard enough to scrape that surface scale off to get you back to clean metal. But I'm going to do it with a belt grinder because it's faster. So, as you can see, I didn't clean off all the scale. I just need to have enough clean surface to be able to see the temper colors. And it's very important at this stage especially to not overheat when you're grinding and start getting those temper colors in from the grinder, because you could end up getting soft spots in steel. But now that that's done, we'll move out to the charcoal forge and do our tempering cycle. So as you can see, I've already built up a bed of coals on the forge. I started the charcoal forge up about an hour ago. Let it all settle down, and that's so that we can have a good heat to pass into the blade. All I'm going to do is pass the blade over the heat, trying to focus most of my heat back here at the ricasso, the thickest portion of the blade, and back and forth with the edge facing away from the fire. And the main reason for that is because this is the thinnest section, which will heat up the fastest. I also want to keep the tip away from the heat, because that will also heat up pretty quickly. And all I'm going to do is paint the heat from the forge until I get an even bronze color across the whole thing. This could be done with a blowtorch, such as this blowtorch. All I'd have to do is paint the heat using the blowtorch, constantly switching sides back and forth, making sure I get an even heat, avoiding the thin sections. until I get that even bronze straw color, and then quench it in water. I have a little bit of water here just to quench it off and stop that temper. And I'd perform this 2 or 3 times to make sure that that temper has gone all the way through, quenching it between each time just to freeze that temper and not let it shoot over the temperature. That's what we're going to do now. Okay, so as you can see, I did overshoot my temperature just a little bit in the center. It looks a lot worse than it is because there's a bit of scale there, but we got into the purples and somewhat into the blue on the spine here, which isn't too bad. You got to remember that the temperature hasn't gone all the way through the steel at this stage. It's only on the surface. And what I'll do is I'll scrub this scale off and do this another 2 times to get a nice even temper. But the second temper we're going to do with this will be with the blowtorch. Okay, so I ground the temper colors off from the forge, and now we're going to use the blowtorch. I'm going to turn the flame down. You want a nice cool flame for this. And again, I'm going to concentrate most of the heat on the spine, barely touching the edge with the heat. So, as should be obvious, the torch temper is a little bit more controllable. I have a little bit more heat in here than I have at the tip, but that means I just need to heat that tip up a little bit more, get that temper cover a little bit more even. There's also not as much temper back here, but I can actually fix that afterwards by sinking the blade up to the tang in water and then heating the tang alone, which is something I'll do anyway. But the last temper cycle I will do will be in the gas forge. So, with the gas forge, same as the others, I'm going to paint the heat. I'm actually going to keep the blade outside the forge. I'm not going to stick it in there, because I want the heat to radiate out onto the blade. In this specific forge, obviously heat rises, so it's going to hit the blade as it's coming out, as it's going up. And I'm going to keep the tip outside of the doorway. And this will slowly bring it up to temperature. The slower you can do it, the better, because you want that temper to soak all the way through. So, we'll sit and watch this for a minute. So there we go. And that's a little bit more even than the other two. Mainly because I took my time with this one. You don't really have an option. With the blowtorch you can get this similar evenness, but it just takes a little bit more time. You've got to be a little bit more patient. So, we've tempered that blade, but now we need to temper this one. This one was edge quenched, so only the edge is hard, the spine is already soft. But what we're going to do is called a latent heat temper. So what I've done is I've ground the surface clean, so it doesn't look like it on the camera. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to heat this back up until it's that dark grey colour. So all the way through the blue, all the way through the bronze and browns and purples, and get it to the grey. And then I'm going to pull it out of the vise. The vise is actually a heat sink in this instance. And then I'm going to let those colours run down towards the edge until I get that nice straw on the edge. And this is one way to get a really nice even temper along the blade. I can use a little bit more of a violent heat. Never keep the blue part of the flame on one position on the blade, because that blue part of the flame is a non-oxidizing environment. It's a neutral environment, so the colors won't show up if the flame continues to stay on that spot. Okay, I'm starting to see that blue. There we go. So now I'm going to take it out of the heatsink, out of the vise. Obviously you want to hold it with tongs because it's nice and hot. And we're just going to watch those colors run. It'll take a little while, but this is one of the easiest ways to get a decent heat soak along the whole blade. And if one section, like this heel, is already getting to bronze, if that section heats up a little bit faster than the rest, what you can do is quench that off with a little bit of water. But so far, I think that's going quite well. And again, the longer this takes, the more... Check both sides. Make sure it's evenly flowing on both sides. And that's pretty much it. It might not look like it in the light because the light is a bit harsh, but there is now a nice golden straw along all of the edge, and then this spine and this center section is all that dark blue and purple. But that's all she needs. Now, if you had enough latent heat, you could do this multiple times, or what I would suggest, grind that oxidation off, stick it back in the vise, get that back up to a blue, do it again 3 times, and you'll get a nice even temper all the way. Now, people sometimes ask me why I'm not a fan of edge quenching, and the answer is twofold. Obviously, there is the answer of what happened in the last video can happen, which is that it splits down the line of hardening. But the other reason is because I don't believe it's necessary. So in this case, we've got a fully hardened blade, which has then been tempered in the oven. And if I wanted a soft spine and a hard back for my blade, this is what I would do, rather than edge quenching. And all this is I'm soaking the piece that I do not want to temper, in this case the edge and the tip, in water, and then I'm going to heat the spine of the blade until it's that blue color. This is much like the latent heat temperature, the latent heat temper I should say, but in this case I'm not going to let the colors run into the edge because that's already tempered. In this case, all I am doing is creating a differential hardness between the spine and the edge. I don't suggest doing this in plastic, just in case you're wondering. This will probably damage the container I'm using. Nope. And there we go. Nice catch. A nice hardened blade with a soft spine and a hard edge. Now, if I wanted to, I would have probably put it in a different tray, and this was only for an example. But basically, you want to have the line of water about a third lower than you actually want the line of hardness, because the heat won't creep that close to the water. And obviously, if you had a more controlled flame source, like a oxyacetylene torch or an oxypropane torch, it would be far more controllable. But yeah, that is the basic idea, is that you create the hard spine and soft back, hard edge and soft spine, without needing to edge quench. Pretty simple. So, the natural question then becomes, how do we test what the temper is like on our blades? Are they too hard? Are they too soft? There are a number of tests out there. There is the brass rod test. There is the punch and twist test. I'll cover those in a little bit, but one of my favorite tests, because it's destructive and it's fun and it does demonstrate whether or not you got it hard enough, is a simple scrape test. Now, I took these to the grinder just to create a 90-degree angle on the edge. They're not sharp or anything like that. I've just flattened this out so that there's a 90-degree angle between the bevel and the edge. And all I'll do is take it to a piece of mild steel and try and scrape bits off it. And then look at that 90-degree angle, maybe feel it a little bit with my thumbnail. And if it scrapes pieces off, which this is very easily, and I'm not seeing a rollover in that area, that means that it's harder than mild steel, which is a very good sign. I'm going to test the other two. So this is the fully hardened one, which we then back tempered. Again, no deviation on the edge. You can test up closer towards the tip. Nothing. And then even this little baby one, that scrapes quite nicely. Could use that as a draw, send scraper. And again, I'm not seeing much deviation. There is maybe a little bit of a soft spot right there. So that tells me that there's kind of a bit of softening happening. But it is still harder than the mild steel. The other test we can do, which is a lot more damaging to the blade, which is a little bit more severe, is I need a hammer. And all we do is place the edge on the piece of mild steel, on the edge of the mild steel, and give it a tap. And what should happen is we should dent the mild steel, but not the blade. This is called the chisel test. Yeah, that passes the chisel test. Again, this is a pretty drastic test. But it is effective. And those are two quick tests that you can do just using a piece of mild steel. Now, if you don't want to do those tests, it would require that you grind your knife to a finished edge. Now, seeing as I'm not going to do that to these today, instead I'm going to use a blade that I made in a previous video, my 1 hour knife challenge. And we need a piece of 1/4 inch or maybe 1/2 inch round stock. Originally, it was a brass rod. You don't need to use brass. The only reason they use brass is so that it didn't scratch the blade. But seeing as you're probably not finished grounded at that point, I'm not really worried about it. And what we're going to do is, after we've got our sharpened blade, we're going to place it until we can see the edge flex. We're going to push down on the steel until we can see the edge flex, and then we're going to draw it backwards over the steel. Nice and tough. Nice and hard. And what that's doing is we want to see the edge flex around the rod, but then flip back to true. And we could test that with our fingers. We can do the other side. And you want to put a lot of pressure on, because what's going to happen is either it's going to flex around and stay flexed, in which case it's way too soft. It's going to flex and then chip out, in which case it's too hard. Or it's going to flex and spring back to true, which is the good temper. Now I know that this one is well tempered because I tested it before, but this is a really good way to test if you've got a good spring temper in your blade and you're not too brittle. This is also a good test to see if your grain structure is good, because you will pop chips out if your grain structure is bad. So those are two tests you can use. The third test is another potentially destructive test, and that is the pine block test, or the tip twist test, in which you lock a piece of wood in your vise or on your thing, you stab the tip in, not very far, and then fold it over and pull out chips. Stab it in, fold it over. Do it both ways. And what you're going to do is look at the tip and see if it's folded over, because the tip is normally where you'll overheat during a temper. Now this was, I believe, no, I didn't oven temper this, I flame tempered this, so there was a chance that I'd overheated my tip, but I'm very careful about that. So if I'd overheated my tip, what I would see is the tip would deflect and then stay bent. Or if it was too hard, or perhaps my grain structure wasn't right, it would just snap off. Now, snapping a small portion of your tip off isn't a bad thing if it's going to tell you that your heat treat was bad, because then you can go back and test it again. Now, you'd obviously do this before you put a handle on it, because if you put a handle on it, then do the tests, you may have to throw the whole thing out. But those are a couple of tests that I use quite regularly to test whether my blades are up to standard. There are a number of others, but I'll get into that in another video. So I hope you enjoyed this video and it taught you a little bit about the techniques used in tempering. If you want to know the why and a few more little hints and tips, I'm going to be doing a full in-depth video for my Patreon supporters in the next couple of weeks. The big thing is that tempering is not so much of a difficult thing to do over quenching, because the quench is what guarantees the strength of your blade. The tempering just guarantees the flexibility. But I hope that I opened your eyes to a few more techniques you might be able to use in your workshop to improve your hardening and tempering abilities. The next video will be dealing with issues with hardening and tempering, such as cracks, warps, twists, and that kind of stuff. And that will be a totally in-depth subject that I'm really happy to cover, because it's something that not a lot of us know about how to deal with. But with that being said, if you would like to support the channel, all you have to do is hit that thumbs up button, maybe leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Hit that notification bell to be notified of when I upload a new video. I upload a video every Wednesday, and I also have a live stream on Saturdays at 9 AM Australian Western Standard Time. At the moment I'm uploading 2 videos a week on Wednesdays and Fridays, while I heal from an injury, so you can make use of that while it lasts. If you want to support the channel monetarily, you can support me through Ko-fi, which is in the links down below, or Patreon. Ko-fi is a single-time donation platform, whereas Patreon is a subscription platform, where in Patreon you get access to behind-the-scenes and in-depth deep dives into other things like hardening and tempering and all other kinds of fun knife-making tips. Otherwise, you can buy it from me on Etsy. I have a whole bunch of stuff on my Etsy store at the moment, so if you want to go check that out, again, links will be down in the description below. I hope you have a fantastic week, and I'll see you in my live stream tomorrow.